Welcome to Monday Markers with Charlie. I'll be talking about Jane Grey Swisshelm, fierce abolitionist and protector and defender of women's rights. Jane Grey Swisshelm was an extraordinary woman. She was born in 1815 in a log cabin. There's a bronze marker to her birth on the edge of the old Gimbel's department store right next to the Duquesne Club, the great center of corporate power and privilege in Pittsburgh, and across the street from Trinity Cathedral, where the only marked grave of a Native American is buried there in the late 18th century. Red Pole, village chief of the Shawnee, who died in Pittsburgh trying to negotiate peace with the march of American power westward. That's important because although we're basically doing labor markers, and that's what our brochure is about, I want to also, when we come to October, Indigenous Peoples Month, I do want to talk about some of the state historical markers and important sites of Native American history in this area. I was very involved with three markers, the McKees Rocks Indian Mound, Burial Mound, the the Queen Aliquippa, her last encampment in McKeesport, and Simon Girty marker, not obviously a Native American, but a person who was deeply involved in Native American history. So Jane Grey, at the age of 12, her family had moved to what is today Wilkinsburg. She was going to school in Braddock and Braddock's Field, and she was coming back. She was 12 years old. She was driving the horse and buggy herself alone, and she was caught in a flood there, and a young man, 16 years old, rescued her, helped her out. His name was James Swisshelm, Swisshelm Park being named after the family. James, they eventually married, and it was a pretty rocky marriage. Jane Grey was a fierce, very, very intelligent woman, excellent writer, and had fierce political opinions. James was nowhere near as talented and had a hard time dealing with this wife of his. They moved together to Louisville, Kentucky, and it was there that, as a young woman in her 20s, that Jane Grey Swisshelm, at this point, had her first experience and saw slavery in action, and was absolutely appalled and angered about what she saw. She was a brilliant writer, wrote a wonderful autobiography, but was a reporter. She wrote, "I wondered what had happened that so many men were off work in the middle of the forenoon. I learned that this was the advance guard of a great army of women whippers. I learned that they all lived, in whole or in part, by the sale of their own children and the labor of their mothers extorted by the lash. I came to know one hoary-haired veteran whose entire support came from the natural increase and wages of 19 women, one of whom, a girl of 18, lived with him in a fashionable boarding house, waited on him at table, slept in his room, and whose yearly wages were credited to his board bill." Jane Grey learned that while white women were not subjected to, obviously, to the same level of oppression that black women were, she quickly found that there were many examples of restrictions on the freedom and fairness to white women. She got word that her mother was dying, and she returned to Pittsburgh in order to be at her side, and she did so in defiance of James's order not to come home. When her mother died, her mother made a bequest to transfer the family fortune, such as it was, to Jane Grey Swisshelm. And James objected and claimed that it was his money because women were not allowed to hold property in their own name. If they were married, it became the property of the husband. Jane Grey Swisshelm took that fight into the courts. She won that battle in the Pennsylvania courts, but it was overruled by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court eventually. She was then decided that to find an outlet for the fierce political opinions that she had. She founded a newspaper, a political newspaper, basically geared at women, but not talking about the usual household issues that were usually relegated to the women's pages of the standard newspapers. This fact that a woman with her very strong opinions would found a newspaper caused great consternation and upset, particularly in the southern newspapers who attacked her viciously. One of the headlines in one of the papers said, the world was falling, a woman had started a political newspaper. And the headline that they used was, "She's a man, all but the pantaloons," that a woman would dare to write political opinions. So the typical angry and venomous pen that Jane Grey could really wield when dealing with issues like slavery, she replied to the editors of the Southern paper. "Perhaps you have been busy horse-whipping Sal or Lizzie, stealing some poor man's baby, selling his mother, maybe. You say, and you are witty, that I, and 'tis a pity, of manhood lack but the dress. But you lack manliness, a body clean and new, a soul within it too. Nature must change her plan ere you can be called a man." Like Martin Delany, Swisshelm was particularly outraged by the fugitive slave law. She was hired by Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune to come and be a columnist, a female columnist on political matters. And she, as such, representing the Tribune, she became the first woman to have a place in the Reporters Gallery of the United States Congress. She was a serious political reporter, and she began early on, while she was in Washington as a reporter, investigating Daniel Webster, who had long been an opponent of slavery, but because of his presidential ambitions, had watered down his anti-slavery sentiments to such a degree that he supported the fugitive slave law, which put in jeopardy not only all those fleeing from the harshness of chattel slavery in the South, but any person of color someone could claim that they were a fugitive slave and could strip them of their rights. This was one of the prime causes of the American Civil War, and she attacked Daniel Webster, but she did something which no white reporter would do. She lost her congressional privileges for writing a column that attacked his political betrayal, but she also reported on his personal hypocrisy, that he voted for the extension of slavery while maintaining a mulatto mistress and her children alongside of his white wife. That got her kicked out of Washington and lost her job in New York. Jane Grey Swisshelm worked as a nurse for the Union Army, wounded during the Civil War. She was a deeply religious Protestant. She had a pretty critical view of Catholic immigrants coming in. She didn't report, even though her paper was in Pittsburgh at the time writing. I checked into it. And although there was a little piece cut out of his Heinz History Center's copy of the Visitor, I could find no reference to the cotton mill strikers, and that's not really surprising because her closest ally in Pittsburgh was Charles Avery, who was a cotton mill owner, but also extremely progressive on issues of African American education, had started a school here. So that she would be careful about attacking the cotton mill owners on behalf of the white working class women is maybe not surprising, but it points out, because this was the beginning in a discussion actually on the North Side about whether there was such a thing as wage slavery as well as chattel slavery. And white workers raised at a meeting on the North Side about that they were equivalent to black slavery, which was, of course, not at all true. While many workers, particularly immigrants, were economically oppressed, often there were rapes, there were beatings, there were people thrown out of homes, etc. But by law, their children couldn't be sold, they couldn't be kept in servitude to work for absolutely no compensation. It's important to understand the similarities and the sense that there is a certain type of wage slavery which all workers today struggle against and are insecure about, particularly in an age of pandemics. So it is increasingly important for all of us to deal fairly and justly with both the parallels in history, their important differences, and to look with compassion on our past, but also with a very critical eye, so that we can move forward as a people that is to a society more equal and just for everybody, as well as more respectful for the natural world on which we all depend.